In the cold void of space, Alan, a lone explorer, stumbles upon a discovery that defies all logic. A cryopod, hidden for 150 years, still warm to the touch. The pod, locked in an ancient, abandoned space station, holds the body of an alien woman, her armor radiating heat despite the passage of centuries. She was supposed to be dead, her species lost to the ravages of war. But as the pod opens, her eyes flicker with life, and the silence of space shatters. What happens next is beyond belief. Alan, a man accustomed to the wonders of space, now faces an unimaginable truth. The woman named Danielle is not just a survivor. She is a warrior, one whose race once controlled technologies that could either save or annihilate Earth. With her awakening, the clock is ticking. Her mission, long forgotten, buried in time, holds the key to a weapon that could destroy everything. But this weapon is not just a machine. It is a key to a war that is far from over, and someone is already coming for it. Someone who has been hunting her for years. Intro, 600 words. Alan had been alone for longer than he could remember, exploring the forgotten corners of the galaxy. As a deep space engineer, his job was to recover valuable artifacts and technologies from derelict ships and abandoned stations, the kind of work most would consider dangerous or even pointless. But for him, the isolation was a comfort. It was just another day in the cold depths of space, the vast silence only interrupted by the hum of his ship and the crackling communication systems, now mostly dormant. That was until he discovered the Cryo-Pod. Floating within a derelict station that had long since been marked off any galactic map, Alan's scanners picked up something strange, an anomaly buried deep inside the station's wreckage. A signal, a faint pulse. At first he thought it was just another piece of forgotten tech, a glitch, or worse, a trap. But the signal was consistent, and his curiosity won over his caution. With nothing to lose, he boarded the station, using the old entry codes to unlock its airlock. As the massive door slid open, he felt a chill, not just from the temperature, but from the eerie silence that hung in the air. The walls were covered in dust, and the place smelled of rust and decay. But it wasn't the state of the station that gripped him. It was the cryopod in the corner of the chamber, isolated from everything else, surrounded by strange markings he didn't recognize. The pod was unlike any he had ever seen. It had a sleek, almost alien design, and it was still warm, the heat radiating from it palpable in the otherwise cold station. Alan approached, hesitant but driven by a force he couldn't explain. Something about it called to him, and against all better judgment, he activated the pod's release mechanism. The pod hissed as it opened, revealing a figure inside, encased in armor that shimmered with an unnatural glow. The woman inside, her features masked by the helmet, was beautiful even in her suspended state. Alan couldn't help but be entranced, but that feeling quickly turned to shock when he realized the impossible truth. This alien woman had been frozen for over 150 years. He didn't expect her to wake. He didn't expect the heat from her armor to intensify when he touched it. He didn't expect her eyes to flutter open, meeting his with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. Her name was Danielle, and she had been dead until now. What followed was a revelation unlike anything Alan could have imagined. Danielle wasn't just a survivor. She was a warrior from an ancient alien race, the Virith, whose existence had been erased from history. She was the last of her kind, and her mission had been abandoned in time. Her people had fallen in a war that raged across galaxies, leaving their technologies scattered and lost. The weapon Danielle had carried, hidden deep within the fabric of her memory, was not just a tool. It was a key to unimaginable power, capable of ending entire civilizations in a heartbeat. But the true horror lay not in the weapon itself. It was the realization that the enemies who had destroyed her people, the Ekerans, were still out there, and they had been searching for Danielle, for this weapon, ever since. As the story unfolds, Alan will have to decide whether to trust Danielle, to fight alongside her, or to protect his own species at the cost of the galaxy. Because one thing is certain, the Ekerans are coming, and the stakes have never been higher. Time is running out. The war between the alien races that started long before he was born is about to come crashing into Earth, and Alan, unwittingly, has become the key to its fate. Alan stood in the heart of the derelict space station, the faint hum of his ship's systems, the only sound that broke the oppressive silence. The station was older than anything he had seen before, a forgotten relic from a time long past. His mind raced as his eyes scanned the dimly lit, cluttered corridors. Time had not been kind to this place. Rusted panels, crumbling walls, and broken consoles were all that remained of a once functioning hub of intergalactic activity. Yet despite its dilapidated state, something called to him. It wasn't just the strange signal that had led him here. It was an inexplicable sensation, a nagging feeling that something, or someone, was hidden within these abandoned halls. His hand tightened on the scanner in his palm, the cold metal of the device providing a fleeting sense of reassurance. The signal was faint but persistent, buried deep inside a forgotten room. After moments of hesitation, Alan entered the room. His boots echoed on the metal floor as he stepped inside, his eyes immediately drawn to the object in the corner, a Cryo-Pod. The pod was different from anything he had encountered in his travels. It stood alone in the center of the room, encased in a protective force field that flickered sporadically. The design was sleek and unfamiliar, unlike the human technology he had grown accustomed to. There was no mistaking it. This was alien tech. The faint, almost imperceptible heat emanating from the pod caught Alan's attention. It was strange. The station had been abandoned for centuries, yet the pod felt warm to the touch, as though it had been recently activated. With a deep breath, Alan approached, his heart racing in his chest. The faint hum of the pod intensified as he neared, and a sudden surge of adrenaline shot through him. He wasn't sure what to expect, but part of him knew that what lay inside would change everything. What kind of alien technology was capable of keeping something so warm for so long? His fingers hovered over the panel, and for a brief moment, doubt gripped him. What if this was some sort of trap? A relic from a war long past? A warning left behind for those foolish enough to wander too far into the unknown? The thought lingered in his mind, but his curiosity won over. Alan had seen much in his years as a space explorer, old ruins, mysterious artifacts, and unknown species. But never anything like this. With a flick of his wrist, he activated the pod's release mechanism. The soft hiss of air escaped as the pod's containment field deactivated, and the lid slowly rose. Alan's breath caught in his throat as the interior came into view. The woman inside, frozen in a state of suspended animation, was breathtaking. Her long, dark hair framed a face that was both haunting and beautiful. She was dressed in an intricate suit of armor, gleaming with a strange, almost otherworldly light. Her body remained motionless, but the warmth of her armor sent waves of heat through Alan's gloved fingers. He stepped back, blinking in disbelief. The technology surrounding her was unlike anything he had ever seen, yet it was eerily familiar. The patterns on her suit reminded him of ancient civilizations, their cultures once thriving on Earth, long gone before humanity's rise. As Alan stared, he realized this was no ordinary being. Her presence held the weight of a history that stretched far beyond human comprehension. She was an alien, a being from another world, yet she seemed so human in her form. The sense of unease that had settled in the pit of his stomach deepened. What had happened to this woman? How had she come to be frozen in time? And why had she been left here? Without fully understanding why, Alan reached out once more. His hand hovered over her helmet, his fingers trembling as he touched the surface of her suit. The heat was overwhelming. It felt as though he were touching the sun itself. Yet beneath the warmth, there was something more, something alive, a spark of energy that shouldn't have existed after so many years of dormancy. And then, without warning, her eyes flickered open. Alan stumbled back, his breath caught in his throat as the alien woman's gaze fixed on him. For a moment, everything else seemed to vanish. The station, the desolate silence, the void of space outside. It was just him and her. Her eyes, deep and filled with a distant sorrow, locked onto his, and for the first time in what seemed like an eternity, a living being from another world was looking at him. Her lips parted, her voice barely a whisper. but it carried with it the weight of centuries. "Who are you?" The words barely registered as Alan struggled to comprehend the impossible situation he found himself in. His mind raced, caught between the overwhelming shock of the moment and the growing realization that he had just awakened something far more dangerous than he could have ever anticipated. The alien woman in the pod, Danielle, had been dead, but now she was alive, and her awakening had just set a chain of events in motion that neither of them could control. Danielle's eyes flickered again, and her body shifted within the pod as if waking from a long slumber. Alan froze in place, his heart pounding in his chest. This wasn't supposed to happen. Cryo-sleep technology was designed to preserve life, keep the body in stasis for centuries, not bring it back to life. Yet here she was, alive, her eyes blinking slowly, adjusting to the light of the station's dim, flickering overhead lights. Alan's hand remained poised over the pod's controls, unsure of how to proceed. Was this real? Was she truly alive? Or was this a malfunction of some kind? The warmth of her armor was still intense, like a warning, almost as if it were telling him to stay back, not to touch. But Alan couldn't resist. He leaned closer, his fingers brushing the edge of the pod. His glove hissed against the cool metal, and the contact sent a sudden shock of electricity through his body. He recoiled, almost as if his hand had touched a live wire. But the pod's lid creaked open further, releasing more heat into the stale air. Alan glanced over his shoulder, wondering if he was doing the right thing. But everything inside him screamed that this was something important, something that had to be done. "Hey," Alan said softly, his voice shaking slightly. "Are you all right? Can you understand me?" Danielle's eyes fluttered again. This time they focused on Alan, locking onto him with an intensity that surprised him. It was as if she had been waiting for him, as though her revival had been expected, destined even. Her lips parted, her voice barely audible, but it carried the weight of years, centuries even. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice deep yet soft, like it hadn't been used in years. "Who are you?" Alan could only stare at her. This was not just some random alien. She was something more. A warrior? A survivor? He wasn't sure yet, but the way she spoke, the way she looked at him, it felt like she knew something he didn't. He cleared his throat, trying to steady his thoughts. "You're on a derelict station, lost in deep space. I found you in the Cryo-Pod. You've been in stasis for over 150 years. His words seemed to hang in the air, as if the truth of them was too unbelievable to grasp. Danielle's gaze softened, though the confusion in her eyes remained. She lifted a hand slowly, her fingers twitching as if testing the air, stretching her muscles for the first time in ages. Alan stepped back, allowing her space, though his heart raced at the sight. Her movements were fluid, but there was a distinct stiffness, like she was trying to remember how her body worked. "How long?" she asked, still struggling to comprehend the concept of time, her voice laced with disbelief. 150 years, Alan repeated, feeling the weight of the revelation press down on him. "I didn't expect you to wake up." "Not like this." His mind raced. Was she even supposed to survive this long? What kind of technology had been used to preserve her? And if she had been frozen for so long, what had happened to her people? Danielle shifted in the pod, pulling her legs from beneath her, her movements slow but steady. She seemed to struggle with the weight of her own body, as if her mind and her body hadn't quite reconciled after all this time. Alan watched closely, uncertain whether to help or to give her more time. "What happened to me?" she asked, her voice quiet but filled with urgency, as if the question held more than just the meaning of her personal survival. Alan swallowed hard. There was no easy way to say it. "You were put into stasis after a war. Your people, the Virith, were all but wiped out. I don't know exactly why, but your race disappeared after the war ended. You were left behind, or you were forgotten." The alien woman's face tightened, and she lowered her gaze to her hands, as if inspecting the dark, intricate designs etched into her armor. The patterns were foreign, yet somehow familiar. The Vireth were said to have been a formidable species, one capable of immense technological feats, and the thought of an alien warrior of such power, reduced to a forgotten relic of the past, left Alan with more questions than answers. Her expression softened, and she closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. When she opened them again, they were filled with something far more intense than confusion, something raw. "The war," she muttered under her breath. "I failed. We all failed." Her voice cracked slightly, the hint of sorrow apparent, even after all these years. Alan felt a surge of empathy. Despite the centuries that separated them, despite the alien nature of this woman, Danielle, he could sense her pain. She wasn't just a soldier. She was a survivor, someone who had lived through an unimaginable tragedy. Without thinking, he stepped forward, reaching out to her. "Hey, I'm sorry, but you're alive now. That has to mean something." Danielle lifted her gaze, locking eyes with him. Her gaze was penetrating, almost as if she could read his thoughts. "I'm alive. But for what purpose?" she whispered. "I was meant to stop the war, but now there is nothing left. No one is left." Her words carried the weight of history, and Alan realized with a sickening feeling that her revival wasn't just an anomaly, it was a catalyst. Something had awakened inside of her, and whatever had caused her to be preserved in the first place was now coming back to haunt them both. As Alan tried to make sense of everything that was happening, Danielle suddenly tensed. Her body stiffened and a low growl escaped her throat, barely audible. Alan took a step back, alarmed. "Something's coming," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "They're still out there. The Ekerans. They've been hunting me, and now they know I'm awake." Alan's heart skipped a beat as the full scope of the situation settled over him. The war she had fought in, the enemies she had faced, they were still out there. And now they were coming. For her, for the weapon she carried, and for Earth. The nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun. The air in the abandoned space station seemed to grow heavier as the words left Danielle's mouth. "The Ekerans. They're still out there," she repeated almost to herself, as if confirming the truth of it. Alan, still reeling from the sheer impossibility of the situation, couldn't help but feel a cold shiver run down his spine. It was one thing to discover an alien, and another entirely to realize that this alien had been part of a cosmic war that spanned galaxies, with consequences that could very well be felt here on Earth. Danielle, still seated within the pod, slowly brought her hands to her face. As she touched her helmet, there was a quiet, almost reverent gesture, as if she were reconnecting with an old part of herself that had long since been dormant. Her fingers brushed across the worn surface of her armor, and for a fleeting moment, Alan thought he saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes. "Why did they freeze me?" she murmured, more to herself than to Alan. "Why did they leave me behind?" Alan hesitated, unsure of how to answer her. He had no answers, no knowledge of the galactic history that had brought this woman, this warrior, into his life. All he knew was that she was here now, and with her came the weight of a past that could potentially destroy everything. The war, it ended. "The Vireth lost," Alan said softly, trying to piece together the fragmented details she had given him. "I don't know why they froze you, but I know that your species was devastated. Everyone thought you were gone. Gone forever." Danielle closed her eyes as though blocking out the pain of those memories. Her breathing slowed, but the tension in the air was palpable, as if the very mention of the war brought it back into her body. Every loss, every failure. After a long silence, she spoke again, but this time her voice was firmer, more controlled. "They couldn't kill us all," she said, the words carrying a quiet strength. "But they almost did." Alan's confusion deepened. "Who? Who were your enemies? Who did this to you?" Danielle's eyes flicked to him, and there was a moment of intense stillness between them before she spoke again, her voice cold, calculating. "The Ekerans. They were once allies, but they betrayed us. They were jealous of our technological advancements, our control over the universe's energy. They wanted it all for themselves." Her tone grew sharper, and Alan could hear the simmering anger beneath her words. We were forced to fight a war that we never asked for. The Echerans were ruthless, and their weapons were devastating. Our people fought until the very last, but we couldn't match their firepower. In the end, they won. Alan could see the toll it took on her to relive this, to revisit the pain of the loss. It was one thing to read about such stories in ancient texts or galactic reports, but it was something entirely different to hear it from someone who had lived through it. Why were you frozen? Alan pressed, his mind racing. Why would they leave you behind? Danielle exhaled deeply, her gaze turning toward the small, cracked viewport that looked out into the endless void of space. Her voice was quieter now, as though recalling something too painful to speak aloud. There were secrets. My mission wasn't just to fight. I was tasked with something far greater than that. The weapon, our ultimate weapon, it could destroy the Echerans, end the war once and for all. But it was dangerous. Too dangerous. The council decided it couldn't be allowed to fall into the wrong hands. That's why they froze me. Alan's heart skipped a beat as the implications of her words sunk in. A weapon. So powerful it could change the course of the war, possibly the fate of the entire galaxy. But it wasn't just a weapon. It was a key that could either save or destroy everything. Where is it? Alan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The weapon! Is it still out there? Danielle nodded slowly, her eyes filled with a combination of regret and fear. I don't know exactly. It was hidden. The last orders I received were to protect it at all costs, but something went wrong. The pod, the stasis chamber, was supposed to be a temporary measure. I was to be awakened once the threat had passed, but it never did. The Echerans kept searching, kept hunting. Alan felt a cold wave of realization wash over him. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a protector, a guardian of something that could decide the fate of entire civilizations. He had stumbled upon something far larger than he had ever anticipated. The stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined. And now, he asked, his mind racing, what do we do now? You're awake. The Echerans are coming. What happens next? Danielle's gaze was intense as she met his eyes. We find it. We stop them. And we finish what we started. Alan's stomach twisted. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This wasn't about discovering ancient relics or lost technologies. This was a war that had crossed the stars and now found its way to Earth. And Alan, by simply waking Danielle, had become a part of it. The realization settled in like a weight. The world he had known, the simple, quiet life of exploration, was gone. The universe had opened its doors to a new, darker reality, and there was no turning back. We have to move quickly, Danielle said, her voice cold and determined. They'll be here soon. I can feel it. The Echerans will stop at nothing to get what's theirs. Alan glanced out the viewport, his mind racing. He had no idea what he was walking into, but one thing was certain. He couldn't back out now. The fate of humanity, of all species, was at stake, and it rested in the hands of two unlikely allies. Then let's get to work, Alan said, his voice steady, though his heart was pounding in his chest. Danielle's gaze hardened, and for the first time, Alan saw the warrior beneath the alien woman. The war had been her life, her legacy. She would see it through to the end, no matter the cost. And so would he. The station's artificial lights flickered as Danielle adjusted to her new surroundings, each movement deliberate and calculated. Alan had no idea what he was about to embark on, but with Danielle now awake, the clock was ticking faster than ever. He could feel the tension in the air, an unsettling calm before the inevitable storm. The room was small, but its size felt vast in comparison to the weight of the decisions now pressing down on him. Danielle stood slowly, using the pod for balance. The sound of her armor creaking under the weight of her own movements made Alan tense up. There was something about her presence, that demanded attention. Her stature was imposing, and though she was still adjusting to her physical form, there was a lethal elegance to her every action. She was a warrior, and even after centuries of stasis, it was clear that the warrior within her had not been extinguished. Where do we begin? Alan asked, breaking the silence that had settled between them. He watched as she collected herself, focusing her energy. The moment felt monumental, as though the path ahead would define the rest of their lives. Danielle turned to him, her eyes sharp and focused. "We start by figuring out how much you know about my people and the weapon. There's no time to waste." Her voice was firm, as if she had already assumed command of the situation, and Alan didn't argue. There was no room for second-guessing now. "I know you were a part of the Virith," Alan replied, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "You were one of the last of your kind. But you mentioned a weapon. You said it was hidden. Where exactly is it, and how is it connected to the Echerans?" Danielle's gaze turned distant, her face momentarily blank, as if the memories were resurfacing in real time. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "The weapon isn't just any device," she began slowly, her words carefully measured. "It was developed during the final years of the war, designed to turn the tide in our favor. Its power was unmatched. It could manipulate the very fabric of energy itself, bending space, time, and matter to the will of its wielder." Alan absorbed the information with a growing sense of disbelief. A weapon capable of such power, something that could alter the very fabric of reality? The thought was almost too much to comprehend, but the fear in Danielle's voice told him she wasn't exaggerating. "If the Echerans get their hands on it," she continued, her eyes narrowing, "they'll have the power to rewrite history."
Not just for my people, but for every race across the galaxy. The weapon could be used to eradicate planets, shift the balance of power, create a new order that no one would be able to challenge. Alan's mind reeled. This was no longer just about exploration or discovery. It was a matter of survival, not just for Earth, but for every sentient being in the universe. The gravity of the situation pressed heavily on his chest, and he swallowed hard. "But why were you put into stasis? Why were you left behind? Didn't you have a mission to stop this?" Danielle's expression hardened, the sorrow and regret that had been evident earlier turning to steely resolve. "My mission was to protect the weapon. It had to remain hidden, but the war ended before it could be fully secured. The Council, they ordered me to enter stasis to wait for a time when the weapon would be needed. I was supposed to be awakened once the Echerans were no longer a threat." Alan couldn't help but feel the weight of her words. The Echerans weren't just some old adversaries, they were still out there, and they were coming. He could feel the urgency building in the air, a palpable force pushing them forward. "But what happened to the weapon? Where is it now?" Alan pressed. He needed answers, clear, definitive ones. Danielle's gaze flickered to the control panel that sat near the pod. It was covered in dust, the interface blinking weakly in the dim light. She walked over to it and ran her fingers across the interface. The lights flickered before a holographic map projected into the air, a map of the galaxy, dotted with different systems, some marked in red. "The weapon is hidden," Danielle said, her voice taking on an edge of frustration. "It's buried deep in one of the lost worlds, the farthest reaches of known space, a place so isolated, so uncharted, that even the Echerans have not found it. But their forces are growing, and they're closing in. They know I was sent to protect it. They know I was the last line of defense." Alan stepped closer to the map, his heart racing. The location was far off, in the outer rims of the galaxy. But if the Echerans were hunting for the weapon, they would stop at nothing to find it, and Alan had no idea what it would take to stop them. "How do we get there?" Alan asked, his voice tense with the weight of their mission. "How do we stop them from reaching the weapon first?" Danielle turned to him, her face grim, her eyes glowing with determination. "We can't do it alone. I can't do it alone. We'll need to go to a place where the Echerans won't expect us. A place hidden within their own territory, a forgotten sector. But I can't do it unless I know for sure we're ready. The weapon isn't just a tool. It's a test. And it's not just the Echerans we're up against." Alan's brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" Danielle hesitated, and for a moment, her eyes flashed with something darker, something far more dangerous. The weapon was never just about winning the war, it was about control. And there are others who will stop at nothing to possess it, even if it means destroying everything in their path. We will face enemies far greater than the Echerans, and they will stop at nothing to claim what's rightfully theirs. A chill ran down Alan's spine. He had thought the Ekerans were the greatest threat, but now he realized that they were only one piece of a much larger puzzle. "So, what do we do now?" Alan asked, the weight of the question hanging in the air. The future seemed uncertain, but one thing was clear. Danielle was the only key to finding the weapon, and with it, the power to change the course of the war. Danielle met his gaze, her voice steady and resolute. "We find the weapon, we stop the Ekerans, and we finish what we started." And just like that, the world Alan had known seemed to shift beneath his feet. No longer was he just a lone explorer in the vastness of space. He was a key player in a galactic war that would determine the fate of all life across the universe. The path ahead was unclear, but Alan knew one thing. There was no turning back. The quiet of the station was broken only by the soft beeping of the console, signaling the slow progress of the information Danielle had accessed. The map of the galaxy, broken, chaotic, and incomplete, glowed faintly in the darkened room. Alan couldn't take his eyes off the holographic projections that hovered between them. It wasn't just about finding the weapon anymore. It was about understanding the web of dangers they were about to walk into. Danielle had been hesitant to speak of her mission at first, but the truth was starting to unfold in front of Alan like the pages of an ancient text he had no context for. The pieces of her past, the war, and the weapon all began to coalesce into something far more dangerous than he could have imagined. She had told him that the weapon was far more than a device of destruction. It was a tool of control. It was meant to shift the power balance across the galaxy, to give the Virith an overwhelming advantage over all other species. But there was more to it. As Alan watched the map shift before him, the implications of what Danielle had said began to take root in his mind. "The weapon is not just a weapon," Danielle said, breaking the silence. Her voice was heavy, filled with the weight of responsibility. "It's a key to something far older than my people, far older than the Ekerans. It was created long before either of our races ever existed." Alan's pulse quickened. His mind struggled to catch up with the implications of her words. "What do you mean? What could possibly be older than the Ekerans or your people?" Danielle's eyes darkened, and her gaze shifted away from the map, focusing instead on some unseen point in the distance. The weapon was never just intended to fight the Ekerans. It was designed to control the forces that gave rise to the Ekerans, to control the galaxy itself. It was a failsafe in case our enemies gained access to the very forces we could not control. The weapon was a safeguard against a power too great for any civilization to handle. Alan felt a chill settle in his chest. It was impossible to process everything. A weapon, created to control something beyond even the most advanced species in the galaxy? What could possibly exist that would require such a weapon? "You're telling me that the weapon, it wasn't just to win the war? It was something much larger than that?" Alan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Danielle nodded gravely. "Exactly. The Ekerans were just a symptom, a result of the imbalance in the galaxy, but the true threat is a force that exists beyond them." Her voice grew quieter, more urgent. "And now, with the weapon out of their reach, the Ekerans are not the only ones who will stop at nothing to claim it. There are others who've been waiting, watching. The true masters of the power the weapon controls, they will come for it too." Alan's stomach dropped. A cold sweat gathered at his brow. His mind raced with the thought of the galactic powers who had been lurking in the shadows, waiting for this very moment. He'd thought he was just a bystander, caught up in the ripples of this cosmic conflict, but now he realized he was part of it, whether he liked it or not. "You're not telling me the full story," Alan said, finally voicing the suspicion that had been building inside him. "You're hiding something. Who are these others you're talking about?" Danielle's expression darkened even further, and for a moment, the weight of centuries of secrets seemed to settle over her. "The ones who will come for the weapon, they are not like the Ekerans. They are not bound by any code or race. They are ancient. They have existed since before the rise of the Virith, before the Ekerans, before any of us. The weapon was built to ensure that no one could control them, not the Virith, not the Ekerans, and certainly not any of the races who think they can rule the galaxy. Alan's mind reeled. Are you telling me that there's something worse than the Ekerans out there? Something that could destroy everything we know? Danielle nodded again, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made his breath catch. Yes, there are those who have been waiting for the right moment, for the weapon to awaken. They are the ones who sought to destroy us long ago. They were the architects of the war between my people and the Ekerans, manipulating both sides for their own ends. They are called the Creators. The name hit Alan like a punch to the gut. The Creators? Danielle's voice grew softer, more guarded. The Creators were the first to harness the ancient powers, the ones the weapon controls. They were an advanced race, beyond even what the Ekerans are now. But they are not alive in the way we understand. They exist in a way that transcends physical form. They are beings of pure energy, capable of reshaping entire systems, destroying them with a thought. Alan stared at her, struggling to grasp the enormity of what she was saying. Creators of pure energy? Beings so powerful they could warp entire systems at will? The very thought of such power was almost incomprehensible. And yet, here was Danielle, telling him that the weapon they were seeking could stop them. So, the weapon... Alan trailed off, trying to make sense of it all. The weapon is meant to keep these creators from coming back, to stop them from... what? Destroying the galaxy? Danielle's gaze was distant, but her tone was unyielding. Exactly. The creators are the real threat. The Ekerans, the Virith, and all the other species. None of us are truly in control. The weapon is the key to holding back the creators, to keeping them dormant. But if the wrong hands get a hold of it...
There will be nothing left to stop them. Alan felt the full weight of her words settle over him, suffocating in its enormity. The battle for control of the weapon was no longer just a war for supremacy. It was a fight for survival itself. The creators were real, and if they were allowed to return, everything they knew would be wiped out. The room seemed to spin around Alan as the full scope of the situation took root. It was no longer just about finding a weapon. It was about ensuring that the very fabric of existence itself didn't fall into the wrong hands. Danielle's voice broke through his spiraling thoughts. This is why I need you, Alan. You're the only one who can help me. Together we can stop the creators from returning. But we must act fast. Alan shook his head, trying to clear the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. Where do we even start? How do we stop something so powerful? Danielle turned toward the map once more, her eyes locked on the farthest reaches of the galaxy. We start by going where they'll never expect us, to the place where the weapon is hidden. The rest, we'll figure out as we go. The sense of finality in her words was undeniable. They were now caught in the web of a war that had been brewing long before their time, and the future of everything, galaxies, civilizations, and species, rested on their ability to unlock the weapon before the creators, or worse, the Ekerans, could claim it for themselves. Alan glanced at her, the weight of their task sinking in. There was no turning back now. We move fast, he said, the resolve in his voice hardening. And we don't stop until we find it. Danielle nodded, and for the first time since waking, a faint trace of a smile flickered on her face. It was fleeting, but it was enough to ignite a spark of hope in Alan's chest. They might not know what awaited them, but one thing was certain. They would fight until the end. The quiet hum of the station's systems was no comfort now. The calm that had once filled Alan with a sense of isolation now felt oppressive, weighed down by the enormity of their mission. The map of the galaxy that hung in front of them, a map filled with red markers, ancient symbols, and forgotten coordinates, seemed to pulse with an urgency that couldn't be ignored. Danielle, standing beside the holographic display, focused on the coordinates she had inputted. Her fingers moved with precision, as though she were navigating terrain she had walked countless times before. Alan watched her closely, aware that she was more than just a survivor. She was the key to this mission, and her calm exterior hid the battle-worn warrior beneath. I've identified the most likely location, Danielle said, her voice sharp. It's in the outer rim of the galaxy, an uncharted sector, long believed to be empty. But that's where they hid the weapon. If we're going to beat the Ekerans, we need to get there before they do. Alan nodded, trying to steady his nerves. The journey would be long, fraught with dangers he couldn't yet comprehend. They would be leaving the station behind, venturing into unknown space, with the weight of the galaxy's fate resting on their shoulders. It was a journey neither of them could afford to fail. We'll need a ship, Alan said. The station isn't going to be able to get us where we need to go. We'll need something fast, and it needs to be equipped for anything we might encounter along the way. Danielle gave him a sidelong glance, her expression unreadable. I've got a few ships stashed away, but we can't afford to attract too much attention. The Ekerans will be watching. Alan didn't ask how Danielle had access to ships. At this point, nothing about her past seemed to surprise him. Her knowledge of the galaxy's hidden corners and the technology of her people was vast. But as she turned to the console and began inputting more commands, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that they were already too late. The Ekorans weren't just another enemy. They were relentless, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. The hairs on the back of Alan's neck stood up as a sudden, sharp alarm blared from the station's control room. It was an unmistakable sound, the kind of noise that warned of imminent danger. His heart skipped a beat as he turned toward Danielle, who had already moved toward the control panel. Not good, she muttered, her fingers flying over the keys. We've been compromised. The Ekerans must have detected the station's energy signature. They're heading toward us. Alan's stomach churned with anxiety. He'd hoped they had more time to prepare, but it seemed the Ekerans had already found them. The battle was no longer in the future. It was happening now. Can we escape? Alan asked, his voice tense with urgency. He needed answers. He needed a way out. Danielle's face was taut with concentration as she worked quickly to bring up the station's defense systems. The station's defensive grid is ancient, but it might buy us some time. I can initiate a false power surge, but it'll only last for so long. We'll have to make our move fast. Alan's pulse raced. The Ekerans weren't just after the station. They were after Danielle and whatever secret she carried. He couldn't allow them to take her, couldn't let them get their hands on the weapon before they did. Do it, Alan said, already turning to prepare for the worst. Danielle's fingers hovered over the console. A surge of energy lit up the control panel as she initiated the false power boost. The lights throughout the station flickered violently, and a loud grinding noise filled the room as the entire structure seemed to shake. The Ekerans were close, too close. Alan could feel the tension crackling in the air. Within moments, Danielle's plan took effect. The station's external systems flared to life, sending out a burst of energy that momentarily masked their location. Alan had no idea how long it would work, but he wasn't willing to waste any time. Let's move, he said, his voice cutting through the tension. Danielle nodded. The seriousness in her eyes matched the gravity of the situation. The ship's ready, but we'll have to move quickly. They sprinted through the corridors of the station, their footsteps echoing in the otherwise silent expanse. Alan couldn't help but feel like they were running out of time, like the walls of the station were closing in around them. But he kept moving, driven by the knowledge that their only chance at survival, at stopping the Ekerans and finding the weapon, was to keep going. As they reached the docking bay, Alan saw the ship Danielle had mentioned. It was sleek, built for speed, and equipped for stealth. There was no time for questions. Without hesitation, they boarded the ship, and Danielle took the helm. "Buckle up," Danielle said, her tone grim. "This is going to be a bumpy ride." Alan strapped himself into the nearest seat, his fingers gripping the armrests. He could feel the tension building as Danielle powered up the engines, the hum of the ship's systems coming to life around them. The ship was small but powerful, designed to outrun anything in its path. "Ready?" Danielle asked, her fingers hovering over the controls. Alan nodded, his gaze fixed on the viewport as the stars outside began to blur. "Let's go." With a sudden jolt, the ship launched forward, the station's lights fading as they tore through space. Alan could feel the force of the acceleration pushing him back into his seat. The station they had left behind was now just a speck in the distance. But the Ekerans were still out there, and they weren't the only ones hunting for them. As the ship blasted through the void, Alan knew one thing for certain. They were no longer running from the past. They were running straight into the heart of a war that had been raging for centuries. And this time, the stakes were higher than they could ever have imagined. "We'll need to reach the coordinates before they do," Danielle said, her voice steady, though her eyes were filled with the gravity of what lay ahead. "There's no turning back now." Alan looked out the viewport, watching the stars streak by, and for the first time since this all began, he understood the true scale of the war they were entering. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about the fate of everything, and the enemy was already closing in. The silence in the ship's cockpit was deafening as the stars stretched by in their streaks of light. Alan sat strapped into his seat, staring at the void outside, his mind racing with the weight of everything that had happened. He could feel the tension in the air, palpable and thick, as if every second counted. The hum of the engines was the only sound filling the space, a constant reminder that they were flying towards something they couldn't yet fully comprehend. Danielle was focused on the controls, her eyes scanning the data that flowed across the ship's display. She seemed calm, but Alan knew better. Her entire being was on edge. She had been through more than he could imagine. But this mission, this final push to retrieve the weapon, was something even she couldn't predict. "How far are we?" Alan asked, breaking the silence. His voice was tight with uncertainty. Danielle's voice, cold but steady, came back to him. "We're close. Less than an hour away." Alan's heart rate quickened. The ship was moving at incredible speeds, and yet the deeper they traveled into the unknown, the more uncertain the situation became. The weapon, hidden for so long, a relic of an ancient war, was now within their grasp. But the Acherons were on their trail, and there was no doubt in his mind that they would stop at nothing to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs. Alan turned to Danielle, his mind spinning. He needed to understand more. He needed to know why this weapon, this key to controlling the galaxy, was so important, not just to the Acherons, but to Danielle's people as well. It seemed that everyone had a stake in it, and yet he had only scratched the surface. "You said this weapon can control the galaxy's energy," Alan began, his voice betraying the confusion that had been building within him. "But why is it so crucial? What happens if the Acherons get it first? Why can't you just destroy it?" Danielle didn't look at him as she spoke, but her voice was filled with quiet intensity. "The weapon isn't just an instrument of destruction, it's a failsafe, a way to control forces we couldn't understand or tame. If the Acherons get it, they won't just use it to win a war. They'll use it to dominate all civilizations, manipulate the very fabric of space and time." Alan's stomach dropped. He had known the weapon was powerful, but this was beyond anything he had imagined. "So, the weapon is meant to keep the balance, to make sure one race doesn't become too powerful?" Danielle nodded. "Exactly. If the wrong hands control it, they can rewrite history, control the fates of planets. The Acherons have already proven that they'll stop at nothing to conquer, and if they possess the weapon, the rest of the galaxy will be nothing more than pawns in their war." The weight of her words hit Alan with full force. The stakes were beyond just winning or losing a war. They were about preserving the very essence of life across the galaxy. This weapon, if placed in the wrong hands, would alter everything. The balance of power could be lost forever. He sat back in his seat, processing everything Danielle had just said. They weren't just in a race against time to find the weapon. They were in a fight to protect the future itself. A sudden alarm rang through the cockpit, cutting through Alan's thoughts. Danielle's eyes darted to the control panel. A red warning flashed across the screen, and she immediately began typing furiously. Alan's heart sank. The Acherons had found them. "We're not going to make it," Alan muttered under his breath, the panic creeping into his voice. Danielle's fingers flew over the console as she brought the ship into evasive maneuvers. "They're closing in faster than I anticipated. They've picked up our trail." Alan's eyes widened. He could feel the ship veering sharply, the rapid turns and acceleration sending his stomach into a lurch. The ship's engines screamed as Danielle pushed it to its limits. He watched as the stars outside began to shift and warp, the ship jumping to near light speed in an attempt to outrun their pursuers. But he knew it wouldn't be enough. The Acherons were relentless, and if they caught up with them, What's our plan? Alan asked, the words urgent. How do we stop them? Danielle's face tightened, her focus unbreakable. We can't outrun them forever, but we can buy ourselves time. There's a hidden planet just ahead, an old outpost. It's off the grid, isolated. I'll take us there, and we'll make our stand. Alan's eyes narrowed. A hidden planet? Where? How do you know about this place? Danielle's gaze was steely, but there was a hint of something softer, something almost regretful in her eyes. I've been there before. It's a safe haven for those who've escaped the Echerans, smugglers, rebels, survivors. If we can get there, we can regroup and figure out our next move. But we have to act fast. Alan wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or more tense. The thought of taking refuge on a hidden planet sounded like a temporary solution, but he didn't have the luxury of second-guessing. The Echerans were closing in on them, and they needed a plan, even if it was risky. We have no other choice, Alan said, his voice low but firm. Take us there. Now. Danielle didn't hesitate. She pulled the ship into a sharp turn, her hands steady on the controls as she expertly maneuvered the vessel through space. Alan could see the panic in her eyes, the strain of knowing that the fate of everything hinged on their ability to stay one step ahead. They weren't just running from the Echerans anymore. They were running from the weight of a universe on the brink of collapse. As the ship shot forward into the darkness of space, Alan's mind raced. He knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. The Echerans would be relentless. And even if they made it to the hidden planet, there was still the matter of the weapon that could either save them or destroy everything. We're almost there, Danielle said, her voice steady. Get ready. This is where the real battle begins. Alan took a deep breath, his hands gripping the edge of his seat. They were close to the planet, close to the weapon, and the Echerans were closer than ever. There was no turning back now. Let's finish this, Alan said, his voice determined. Danielle nodded in agreement. The hidden planet loomed ahead, its atmosphere shrouded in a layer of mist and fog. The ship's exterior lights reflected off the swirling clouds as they descended toward its surface. Alan could feel the tension in the air, the oppressive weight of the situation pressing on him from all sides. They had made it here, but their journey wasn't over, not by a long shot. The Echerans were close, too close. Danielle's earlier attempt to throw them off the trail had worked for a while, but now they were within range, their ships looming ominously in the distance. The battle for the weapon had escalated from a race to a deadly pursuit, and now, standing on the precipice of their final confrontation, Alan had to make a choice that would alter the course of their lives forever. Are we ready? Alan asked, his voice steady despite the chaos brewing outside. Danielle was silent for a moment, her hands gripping the controls of the ship. Her gaze was fixed on the planet's surface as they neared the entrance to the hidden outpost. The fog parted, revealing a craggy landscape below, dotted with ruins of an ancient civilization, left behind by those who had escaped the ravages of galactic war. We're ready, Danielle replied, but there was something in her tone that unsettled Alan. She was holding something back, a deeper level of concern that didn't go unnoticed. As the ship touched down on the hidden planet's surface, Alan felt a surge of adrenaline. This was their last refuge, the only place left where they could regroup and make their final stand. They had a moment, just a moment, to prepare for what was to come, but that moment felt fleeting, as if time itself was against them. Alan stood up from his seat, his mind racing with thoughts of what had to come next. We've got to make sure we're not caught off guard, he said. We need to find the weapon, and fast. The Echerans are coming for us. Danielle nodded, but there was an intensity in her eyes, a sadness that she couldn't quite mask. She turned to him, her face drawn tight with the weight of the decision she knew was looming ahead. Alan, she began, her voice soft but urgent, there's something you need to understand about the weapon, and about me. Alan's brow furrowed. What is it? What's going on, Danielle? She took a step toward him, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of sorrow and resolve. The weapon, it's not just about controlling the Echerans. It's not just about stopping them from taking control of the galaxy. The weapon was meant to be a failsafe, a final line of defense to protect the galaxy from something far worse than them. Alan's heart skipped a beat as he tried to process her words, What are you talking about? Danielle's gaze shifted toward the ship's window, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. The creators. I told you about them, but I didn't tell you everything. The weapon is not just a tool of war, it is a lock to keep the creators' power contained. If the weapon falls into the wrong hands, if it's activated, the creators will rise again. The realization hit Alan like a tidal wave. The Ekerans weren't the real threat. They were just pawns in a much larger game, a game that had been in motion long before Alan and Danielle had ever crossed paths. The weapon was far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. It was a key to unlocking the kind of power that could obliterate the entire galaxy. So if the weapon is activated, it will open the door for the creators to return? Alan asked, the words heavy with dread. Danielle nodded, her face a mask of determination. Yes, and the Ekerans know that. They want the weapon because they believe they can control it, but they can't. The weapon's power is not something any one race can wield, not even the Virith, not even the Ekerans. If it's triggered, it will unleash the creators, the very beings who can reshape reality itself. Alan's mind spun with the implications. He had thought he understood the stakes, but now it was clear that the true battle wasn't just between the Virith and the Ekerans. It was a battle for survival against forces older than time itself. You're saying that we can't let the Ekerans get their hands on it because they'll trigger the creator's return? Alan asked, his voice tight with urgency. Danielle's gaze softened, and for a moment she seemed to age before his eyes, the weight of her centuries of knowledge crashing down on her shoulders. Exactly, and that's why I have to be the one to stop them. Alan's heart sank. What do you mean? We can't let you do this alone. We'll fight together. Danielle shook her head, her expression resolute. No, Alan, this is my responsibility. The weapon is bound to me. I was the last line of defense, and it is my duty to ensure that the creators never return. If I don't destroy it now, there will be no stopping what comes next. Alan took a step toward her, his voice desperate.